So it's lesson 2 of Intro to Web Programming. So our whole focus of today's class is how do we use the browser and use server-side scripting to get information from users on our web applications. Let's think about some examples. What are some websites that you go on where you provide data and that website takes your information from a user and saves that? What's a website you go on regularly where you're adding new data into that application? Okay, what kind of data can you add on Facebook? Okay, yep, so anytime we want to add a post, we can just go to our profile and I can just type something in, right? They give me a text box. I can type one line or I can type in a whole block of, and I can submit it in there. Okay. What else, where else do you go regularly where you're adding data into that website? Okay. So, okay, we can go to Twitter and all I need to do, so when I click that button, I'm letting Twitter know, hey, I want to provide some new data for you to save. And it looks similar to the Facebook post box, right? I have a text area, so I can type some text. Where else might we go where we want to add? Raj?
We can change profile pictures, so in that way we are adding new pictures.
Sure, so we can go in. So not only can we add text, right? I can choose to upload files if I want, right? So I can go and find an image and put that in. Where else do you go most days where the website gives you some container, some ability to provide other data? Okay, could be. Yep. So we're gonna click on. So in a photo, if I go to my photos, right, I could click and tag somebody if I want to. So I'm providing information. So I can upload files, I can type, I can even provide information just with a click. Right? If I want to go back, so I can tag somebody, even just to say add a friend. All I'm going to do is click, but I'm going to be sending information to Facebook, right? It's going to store that friend request in the database, and then it's going to send out an email to Scott and send him my request. Right? So there's all kinds of ways that we can capture data, but the whole basic process kind of looks like this. Back to our week 2. So here's how the process works, and it really doesn't matter what kind of data we're asking for users, whether we're letting them type stuff, whether we're letting them upload files, or whether we're really just letting them click on something to give us some kind of input that we need to store. This basically happens in 2 parts. So the first part is we give the user some ability to provide us with some kind of information. They click something, they type something, they upload a file, whatever it is. So we need to give them some kind of input container, and typically what we're going to use is an HTML form. Right? So an HTML form, it contains all of the inputs that we want from users. So if you think about it, it's kind of like going to the grocery store, right? Before, when you come to the grocery store, what's the very first thing you grab, typically, if you need a lot of food? You walk in the door, and what's the first thing you get? Right, you're going to get a cart, because you're not going to be able to carry around all of the food you want to buy. So the cart is your container. It holds all the things that you want. Okay? So on a web page, our HTML form, it serves as kind of like our shopping cart for all the information we want from users. Let's maybe go and see if we can find a, let's go here for a minute. I shall open it in a private window. So here we've got a registration form. So we've got a bunch of different inputs. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different inputs this website is asking us for in order to sign up. So if we go and inspect this and we look at the HTML source, somewhere in here, whoops, sorry, I'll do it this way. If we view the source of the page, whoops, I lost my inputs, we're going to see that there's a form around it. We may even see one here. If we can view the page source, we'll see if we can find our form here. Yep, so there's actually 8 forms on this page. So any place we're asking users for inputs, we're going to hold that, have that form. So the form, all it can really do is ask the user, set up what list of inputs we want from the user. If we want them to upload a file, we have to give them a browse button. If we want them to type text, we need to give them text boxes. What other kinds of inputs might we have on our form? You can actually see some of them. Oops, where were we? So here we've got single line text boxes. On Facebook and Twitter, we had multi-line text boxes for making a new post or a new tweet. What about here? What kind of input have we got? Oh, we're not moving enough. Here, do I need to do this? Need to jump up, wave my arms in the air? Oh. So we can give users drop downs. What other options do we have for giving users inputs? What else could we give them besides single line text boxes, multi-line text boxes, drop down lists? Yeah, we might use radio buttons. We might use check boxes. Right? Now, radio button and drop down lists, let's talk about those for a minute. They would both do basically the same thing, right? We want to give the user a list of choices, and how many options are they allowed to pick from that list? Yeah, just one. So why did they use, so they could have used a radio button list here. Why did they use a drop-down list instead? A radio button list, it would work, probably not as good from a usability point of view. Yeah, with a radio button list, all of the choices are visible. So it requires a lot of space on our page. Drop downs, well, they don't require a lot of space because we don't see the choices unless we click. So in that case, for this case, we used a drop down. For some cases, using a radio button list might be better than a drop down. When would you use a radio button list instead of a drop down? Yeah, so it has to typically do with how many choices do we have and how big are those choices. If we have lots of choices or the description of those choices is really long, well, then we're probably better putting on a drop-down list. If we have only a few choices and the text of those choices is small, well, a radio button list is easier for our users because they can see all the choices. They don't have to click anything to see them. So it's not that one is wrong and one is right. It's about trying to develop a good user interface, which is something I know you're learning in some of your other classes. So we've got drop-downs, check boxes. Anything else we can give users so that they can give us input? Let's go back here for a second. Right? If we go back, what kind of input do I have here? Yeah, it's just a button. By clicking this button, instead of this one, I have no idea who that guy is, right? That's going to perform a similar operation, but it's going to act on a different account in the Facebook database. So oftentimes just clicking a button is a way for us to get input from a user. Okay. So when we're designing our forms, what we always need to know from our clients is what information do you need from your users? So that's going to help us decide. So for example, Globe and Mail, they decided they don't need somebody's address. You can sign up and register on their website without providing a phone number or an address. But they did want at least the country and postal code. So we need to know what inputs are required from users, which ones are optional, and then which type of input control makes the most sense to make it really easy for somebody to use this page. Okay. So it's not exactly a science. There's a bit of an art to designing good user input forms so that it's easy for people to use and easy for them to give us the kind of information we want. So that's the first part of the process here. Our shopping cart is like our HTML form. It collects all the inputs from the users. What do we typically see at the bottom of any kind of input form? Yeah, usually we've got a button, and when we're done putting all our inputs in, we click that button. So the shopping cart, creating the form, that's really the easy part. It's really just setting up a presentation and a bunch of inputs for people to give us the data. And we might do some checking to make sure they give us the right kinds of data. But most of the actual processing is going to happen on the next page. Because the reason is our HTML, it can collect the information, but it can't really process it, right? Think about it. We're in the grocery store. We filled our shopping cart up. We've put all the food that we want in. What do we do next? We just walk out at the store and put the food in our car or walk home with the shopping cart? It'd be nice if we could.
They would call 911.
Yeah, they would probably call 911. So what do you have to do when you're done putting all of the things you want into that container? Okay, right. So you're going to go up to the checkout counter. You can't pay right away. There's even a step that happens before we pay. So we go up to the checkout counter. What do we have to do before you pay? Yeah, right. The cashier, or you have to do it yourself now, right? If you go to the self-checkout line, you have to process every item and calculate how much it is that you owe. Right? Now, your shopping cart can't do this. This would be a great idea. Somebody should invent one. It should be the shopping cart that has a scanner. So as you put things in the shopping cart, it can scan and tell you how much you owe. Right? But right now, the shopping cart can't do that. Just like your HTML form can't process the inputs. All it can do is collect them. It's dumb. It's just a container. So at the grocery store, we have to scan our items, calculate the total, and then we have to process our payment. That's really what our PHP code is going to do with all those inputs. HTML form is going to collect them. It's going to send that data to the server, and we're going to need to use PHP or some other server-side scripting language to interpret and check all of those inputs and then process them. And usually what we do in all the examples we've looked at, like here or here or here, once we're done processing, we ultimately want those inputs to get saved into a database. So if we're on Facebook and we make a new post, we want that post to go into the Facebook database so it will show up on our profile and it will show up on all our friends' walls. When we're here and we submit this, what do we want to happen with our information? Where's it going to go? Yeah, it's going to go to the Globe and Mail's database and create a user account for us. So we can come back and have that account. If I tweet something here, it's going to save that to the Twitter database. If I upload a photo, it's also going to add that photo, copy that photo onto the Facebook server, and again, save a copy of that photo record into my profile. So it shows in my list of photos, and so that anybody who's friends with me can see it. So it's the same thing happening each time. We use the web, could be on a phone, could be on a desktop, could be on a tablet. We give the user some kind of web page, we ask them for information, we process that information, and then we're going to ultimately save it into the database. So that's why we do this course at the same time as your relational database course. So in that course, you learn how to build and structure and manipulate a database. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, I need a web application to do scheduling. Well, you know how to create those tables in the database to manage the schedule. And now we're going to build the interface on the web so we can add entries into the schedule and save them. And then we can pull that data out and look at it. That's what we're going to do next week. So this week, it's all, the traffic is one way. So from the browser, we get stuff from users and we save it into our database. Next week, what we're going to do is look at going to the reverse. How does a user come here? And when I click on my feed, how do I pull the information out of the database so I can see it? That's what we're going to do next week. And then after that, we'll look at, once we can add and we can retrieve data, how do we edit it or delete it? Once we can do those things, it's actually pretty easy to build a whole web application. So this part is one way. From the browser, data going into the database. That's what we want to get working today. Okay. So I'll kind of keep this diagram up. It's not pretty, but it does explain what we're doing. So we'll come back and refer to it as we're doing different things today. Now, in order to be able to do this, in order to save new data in, so we're going to wind up creating a couple of pages. I think we're going to create 4 pages today, maybe 5. In order for this to work, for our web application to do anything with our database, we always have to be able to connect to the database. So we have our SQL database, we have our web pages, but we need a way for them to be able to talk to each other. So we're going to have to set up a connection for that. So we'll come to the database. We're going to kind of leave this part out at first. First, we're going to create a page where all we want to do is ask the user for some information, let them submit it, and then we want to send that to a PHP page that will process and display that information back. So we'll do that part first, being disconnected from the database. The next thing we're going to do, and it'll probably be in the next hour of class, we said last week, I got to actually check our poll. Does anybody remember what we said we were going to build? We had a little poll last week.
Music.
Right. So we're going to have to decide right, we said music. We're going to have to decide exactly what we want to store. Are we going to store musical acts? Are we going to store albums? Are we going to store songs? Right? We'll figure that out. Then we're going to build our database table together. We'll all create the same table in our database. And then we're going to build some pages so we can actually start saving information in. So we can add in some new albums or new artists or new songs and get that working by the end of class today. Then next week when we come in, we're going to look at how do we build pages to pull that data out of the database and display it in our browser with PHP and HTML. Okay, so let's fire up our code editor. Actually, what I'm going to do first is just make a folder for today's class. Actually, I've already made one. No, so I've got a COMP1006 folder. Here was our lesson 1 we made last week. My files are dated from last week. So I'm going to make a lesson 2 folder. And I'm not going to use any spaces or any capitals. And once I've got my lesson 2 folder, I'm going to open up this folder in my code editor. So whatever editor you used last week is fine. If If you want to try using a different one this week, that's fine too. There's lots of links on Blackboard in the tools and resources folder. For those of you who were in Tom's class, what was Tom using? Visual Studio Code? Okay, so if you want to use Visual Studio Code, that's great. I'm going to use PHP Storm. You're free to use something else as well. You can use Atom or brackets, whatever you like. So I'm just going to open up the lesson 2 folder I just created, which is empty. So I'm going to create a PHP file, and I'll just call it form.php. Doesn't really matter what name you give it. Now, we don't have to give this page a PHP extension. This is going to be our form, our container, where we get inputs from our users. We're not actually putting any PHP on here today, so if you save it with an HTML extension, that's fine. It can be .htm, .html, or .php.
How do we get this on you save the file?
Oh, so when you create a new PHP page, it's blank?
Yeah.
Okay, are you using WebStorm?
Yeah. Okay.
I will show you how to get this template set up for each time you create a new PHP file. That way you don't have to type all of that HTML code. So do this first. So click on New and click HTML file. And just call it template.html. Doesn't really matter what you call it. Okay. Does it give you this code now? Does it give you all that HTML? So now, copy all of that HTML. And now I'm going to right-click my folder again and choose New. And I have this option here that says Edit File Templates. So what we want to do is we want to copy the HTML template to the PHP template.
I could just see the rest of the coding, sir.
Okay, well, there is no code. I haven't written any code yet.
I know. I just wanted to turn this in before we get started with the next step.
Okay, so
It took a while to create a new file. Okay.
So when you choose Edit File Templates, so Raj, now if you click PHP file here in the list, you can just highlight anything that's here and paste it in. And then click OK. So now when you create a new PHP file, it should put all of that HTML template in for you. Did that work?
See the PHP syntax in there. If we click on PHP file, so I need to delete that.
Yeah, so delete whatever's there and then just paste in. So we're basically copying the HTML template as our PHP template. So now whenever we create a new PHP file, it will WebStorm will automatically set up, I'll put that HTML in so we don't have to write it out every time. Okay. So you can just click OK to this. So then if you go and create a new PHP file, it should give you that HTML starter template. So we're going to create a simple form here. So I'll just put on a title. Did you work with HTML forms at all in your class with Scott last semester? A little bit? Okay. We'll put on a form. Now, typically, there's all kinds of different attributes we could specify with our HTML forms. We're generally only interested in 2 of them. We can ignore most of this stuff, but there are 2 of these properties we want to set each time we create a form. Anybody have any idea what properties we should set on our form?
It's action and the method.
You got it. So first we're going to want to specify the action. So I can even just click from that list, double click it, and WebStorm automatically gives me the equal sign in the quote. And notice it's prompting me for the name of another page. So the action means when the user submits this form, which page is going to load in the browser, and in effect it will almost be like that's the page that's going to catch or receive the inputs. Now, so we're going to just call this, we'll send it to a page called processform.php. That page doesn't exist yet. We'll create it next. And we also want to specify the method. And when I just hit enter, I get these two options, get and post. We can use either of them. 99% of the time when we build HTML forms, we're going to use one of these methods. Which one are we going to use most of the time? Get or post? All right, everybody said post, which is right. Why do we? Occasionally we'll use get. Most of the time we're going to use post. Why do we want to use post instead of get? We'll try it both ways and we'll see the difference in a minute. Does anybody know the difference between the two? Okay, so you're right. Yeah, you're right. It's Gary, right? Yeah. So can you explain? You're right, Gary. Can you explain a little bit more?
I'm not sure which one displays, but one of them like shows like a first name, last name, and that value on the address bar.
Right. So when we use get, it will still let us send those values to the server, but all of the inputs the user typed in show up on the end of the web page URL, which isn't very secure, especially if it's a login form where people are typing usernames and passwords. So we'll try it with post. I'll change it to get after so we can see the difference. So we're going to use post. I'll close my tag. Now here's one very important point. When we use our code editor and we close the tag, notice it automatically generates the closing tag. What's really important, my cursor's flashing here, all of my inputs need to go in between those tags. If I start typing my form inputs and my submit button down here, my form's not going to work. So I need to move my end form down to the bottom so all my inputs can go inside. If I leave my closing form tag here and put my inputs underneath, it's kind of like going to the grocery store with my cart. Instead of putting my inputs in my food in my cart, I'm throwing my inputs on the floor. And I keep going, but my cart's empty. Okay, so everything has to go inside the form, just like your groceries need to go inside the cart, not outside of it. So let's put on here, I'll use an HTML field set tag. So these are used for forms. And typically what's inside a field set is a label and an input. So a label that tells the user what we're asking for, and then some kind of input, a text box, a drop down, a radio button, or something else. So let's create a form where we're asking somebody for their name and their email. So we'll have two inputs. So we're just going to have two text boxes. So we'll put on an HTML input tag. We need to give it a name. And we should also give it an ID. Now we could specify this attribute, type equals text. This attribute is optional. Why would it be optional? Yeah, because by default inputs, if we don't specify the type, it will generate a single line text box. So we can include that if we want to, we don't have to. Typically, I will leave out things that aren't required because it just adds extra HTML we don't need to our page. So I'll take that out. You have it in there, it's okay. So that's our first field set. Here's our second one. So we'll put on a label. You can also specify the type as email in HTML5. So this way, HTML5 will generate an error message if the user types in text that isn't formatted like an email address. If they type in 123 or ABC when they go to submit the form, they're not going to be able to. And one thing that's really important, and I will give you marks for this on your assignment, it's something we talked about in programming fundamentals, is our inputs should never be called input 1, input 2, input 3, right? They need to have descriptive names that describe what kind of information each input is holding. And then lastly, down at the bottom, we'll just put on a button that says submit. So this is our container. These are the inputs we want. There's no PHP code on this page. This is just used to gather the information from our end user.
Like we are using the action attribute, and it should point out on a PHP document, or we can point out like .html.
Great question. This page could be an HTML page because it doesn't actually require any PHP scripting, right? We can get those inputs just with HTML. However, remember we talked about last week, the short answer is it has to be a PHP page. Why? Because HTML is dumb. It has no logic. It's for presentation only, displaying information in a browser. But what we need to do is we need to actually process the inputs. So we need to use PHP or C# or JavaScript or some kind of programming language to interpret those values. So if this is HTML, we're not going to be able to read what the user put in the form. Okay? And that's why we need to send it to the server. Now, if we leave this out, we could leave the action out altogether. It would still work. If we leave it out, what will happen when the user fills out the form and hits the submit button? What page will load if we don't specify? So here we're specifying another page name. It won't actually give us a not found. We'll get a different result. What page will get loaded if we don't specify a different URL? Nope. We won't get a 404. Something will load. Well, we'll try it in a minute and see. We'll try it this way. Then I'm going to take out the action and we can see what it does. Okay. Now, if you have a local web server installed, you should be able to run this file on your local server. If you don't, you want to connect to the web server, either to Azure or DreamHost, whichever web server you have configured and connected in FileZilla. You're going to want to upload this file and load it in your browser. So I'll do both. I have it locally on my server, so I'm going to run it on my local path, and then I'll also put it up on the web server and try it. So here's what my form looks like. I have two inputs and a submit button. Notice if I don't put in a validly formatted email address, box turns red. And if I try and submit the form, it says, please enter an email address. So HTML5 is doing some validation here for me. If I want to try running this on the web server, on DreamHost or Azure, I can easily connect. So here's my lesson 2 folder. So I'm going to upload my form. So I have 2 versions running. One is local. And I've used FileZilla, so now I have the same version running on the live web server as well. So in class, if you have the local web server running, it's going to save you time. It means you don't have to copy your files up to the web server with FileZilla every time we make a change. You can just save and refresh your browser. So I would recommend you install a local server for working in class. So now when I put in a proper email address and hit submit, what results should we see? That's fine. That's what should happen. But let's see what happens now without that action. I'm going to take that out for a minute. So I still have my method, but we haven't specified any action at all. So I'll refresh. What just happened? I fill out my form. I press submit. Without the action, which page is the default action page? Which page did it? Yeah, the same page. So the page will post to itself. So it's okay, we could do this. We don't really need a second page, but then our code gets messy, right? Because there's really 2 parts to the process. The first part is collecting the information, and the second part is processing it after the information's been submitted. So you may see some code samples where all this happens on one page. I don't like that model very much. I find it's too messy. It's cleaner to have one page for the form inputs and a second page that will process those form inputs. It's a little easier to write the code that way. So I'm going to put my action back. But we also want to look at post and get. So I'm going to change my method from post to get for a minute. And refresh. So now we're loading process form again. Absolutely right. Now the form inputs are included at the end of my URL. So why is this a really bad idea? Yeah, it could be passwords. Easily accessed by someone else, right? Maybe it's credit card number. And once it shows up this way, it's going to show up in my browser history, right? So if someone starts typing that domain name, they're going to see that page on the list and they can see all the inputs that we had. So we almost never will use get. We'll pretty much always want to specify post. There's one exception, and there's one big warning about this. What happens if I take this out altogether? So we saw when I took out the action, right, the page posted to itself. What will happen here if I don't specify post and I don't specify get? So let me just go back and refresh. When I submit, there's 4 possibilities, right? Possibility number 1 is nothing happens. The form doesn't do anything. Possibility number 2 is I get an error. Possibility number 3 is it works and it does a post. Possibility number 4 is it works and it does a get. Which thing do you think is going to happen? So again, we haven't specified any method at all. You think it will use get? Any other predictions? What will happen? Let's see. Right. So even though 99% of the time we want to use post because it's more secure, which is the default method if you don't specify the method. Yeah, get will be the default. So whenever we create our forms, it's really important to make sure that we add that post method equals post attribute. If we forget it, it means that whatever inputs users type into our forms is going to show up in their addresses, which we don't want, with one very kind of rare exception. And I realize we'll take a break. We'll take a break in just a second. Anybody have any idea of when we do use get? There's one example of a type of input form that commonly we'll see on most websites. They actually use get instead of post for doing one specific type of operation. You got it. Ernest, why would searches typically use get, do you suppose? Okay, so let's search for something. You know, let's search for books in PHP, right? When I hit search, we can see that that search form uses get. How do you know? It should be obvious. Right, we can see right here. So what if I want to search for PHP, both of those things, right? Field dash keywords equals PHP plus MySQL. So I can even modify my search term right here, right? I could add on HTML. And notice it shows the search results. So if you go onto any website and look in their search bar, almost every website will use get for search because they're figuring, maybe wrongly, that people's search terms are in effect public. It's okay. You may not feel you want your search terms to be public, but most websites will do this. So later on, in the probably in I think week 10 or 11, in our little music store website we're going to build, we're going to add the ability to search an album or an artist or a song by keyword, and our little search form will use get. Every other time we build a form, the rest of the course we'll use post for this reason, but you will see it on get. So automatically now, when you go on any website, I guarantee you're going to start to notice this when you search for things. If I search, right, there's our get. There's my keyword. So you'll see this commonly when we're online. But most of the time, unless we're doing a keyword search form, we're going to want to use post instead because it's safer. Okay. Does anybody have any questions so far about our form, our input form? This part's pretty much done. So we've done this part. We basically built the grocery cart, put together our grocery cart so users can give us inputs. So I think we should take a 10-minute break. When we come back, we need to build the PHP page that will receive and process those inputs when the user clicks the submit button. So we'll do that, and then we're going to wire this whole thing up with our MySQL database as well. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break here.